Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years experience with cybersecurity. 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
Awesome. Hey, Mike, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm excited. Michael and I have known each other for quite a long time. So why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and what you guys do over at Burns & Mac.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be on with you today. Like you said, we have known each other for a number of years. Mike Welch with Burns McDonnell. I've been in cybersecurity now for about 25 years. I've owned my own businesses. I've worked as a contractor, worked for companies in all sectors, really gravitated into the utility sector about 15 years ago. So really a lot of passion there. Worked within a global CISO for a food manufacturing company. Currently, I'm working with Burns McDonnell, like I mentioned, in our GRCC practice, which is governance, risk, compliance, and cybersecurity. Within the T&D business line, transmission and distribution, where we're working with our asset owners and our utility clients on how to protect critical infrastructure. With critical infrastructure being a target for many nation states and stuff like that, it really has become paramount to try to make sure they have the right level of protection. It's not just about compliance. You can be compliant and not secure. You could be secure and not compliant, but it's really about managing risk. We're trying to work with them, reputational, operational, strategic, all those things. They all are important, but at the end of the day, it's about reliability when we're talking about the utility space. A lot of generation owners, generation assets, renewables, really moving into transportation electrification, EV vehicles, pipelines. So it's really exciting with what we're doing. We've been around for a number of years and just love to look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I've been saying that. So obviously I've been in the power utility and critical infrastructure world for quite a long time. My dad actually worked in power utility for 38 years before he retired and went to work for a vendor for another 12. So I grew up, it's like coal in my blood. Like I grew up breathing it, going to coal mines and power plants and all that kind of stuff in Texas. So, but growing up and once I created my own career and did this I really started because I was in cyber and network and really dealing in the OT side, even before it was called OT, that term came up that you just talked about, right? Is I can be compliant and not secure, and I can be secure and not compliant. And those are really two targets. So I see this a lot talking to CISOs, talking to plant managers, and they're like, well, we're NERC compliant. Like, what else do we need to do? I've checked that box. Like, that's all I need to do. I'm good, right? No. So talk about why that's such a difference between what compliance is and the goal of it versus just a general cybersecurity posture and when you really tied to that key factor of it's all about risk.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you mentioned, the compliance is usually a floor or at a bare minimum of what one needs to do to have a level of protection. Let's call it general cyber hygiene. And then security is, hey, I have all these layers in place. I have the security in place. They don't always work together. Sure. When we look at governance, it's really how you bring all of that together. And what is the risk appetite for the organization? In the electric utility, yeah, we have a framework that we're driving towards, NERC-CIP. And that's what everybody puts their things for. But that doesn't always manage your risk as a whole. So we have to look at other alternatives if you really truly want to have a overarching governance, risk, and compliance program as a whole. They have to work together. So that's when you talk about, compliant. I'm compliant, but you know what? I might have a vulnerability and that can open up an attack vector to X.
Yeah.
Or, you know what, I'm secure here, but you know what, I didn't meet the revocation process, so I'm now non-compliant.
Right.
So they're two different areas, but they have to work together. And one of the challenges, what we see out there is they're working as silos. The engineers, the cybersecurity practitioners, and the auditors aren't always working together. Each one of them has their own goal. All the things that they're doing is important. It's how can they make sure they're doing it together so they're managing their risk. We set a risk appetite, right? We set thresholds for what that risk guardrails may be. And then we have risk treatments that we put in place. Those are the controls, the things that are in place, administrative, technical, procedural, whatever that may be. They all have to work in tandem. Otherwise, it becomes more ad hoc. And that's something that's not sustainable over the long run.
Yeah, that's where, mistakes start happening. The whole human performance thing of, that's why automation and why, a lot of the processes and capabilities that we've brought over the last 20 years have made such sense. All of these programs, it's about people, process, and technology. I can't just buy a product and throw it in and expect it to solve my problems. I still have to deal with the people and process side of things, because if I have I use this analogy a lot. Like if I have the best woodworking tools in the world in my garage, but I don't know how to use them and I never pick them up, they're not going to build me a desk. Like they're not magical. Having the best tools doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be able to build quality things with it and do things with it. I have to know how to use it. I have to have the materials to use it. I have to have the people with the knowledge to use it. All those things go together to build those the end result of that program, that cyber program, and being able to check the box for compliance, as well as lowering my risk to my business so that I can continue operating and generating electricity or making widgets or whatever those things are. So it really ties into risk and resiliency for availability in these OT spaces.
No, 100%. It's all about reliability and availability. I mean, when we talk about electric utility, as a customer, when I go turn on my light switch, my expectation is the lights are going to come on, right?
Right.
It's a simple way to look at it, but that's what we've all come accustomed to do. So when you are the asset owner, you're managing power for hundreds of thousands, millions of people. If that power is not on, that's a problem. So, and it comes to resilience, right? When we look at resilience, it's really about having the ability to withstand an attack, or it could even be an accidental event, but the system will still operate as it was intended. Well, how do you do that, right? How do you make sure that happens? Because it is not, power generation is not a simple thing. It's a complex process for making sure it gets from the station to the control center, to the transmission line, and then out down to the distribution, right? So there's a lot of moving parts in this process. We as customers just look at turning that switch on, but as asset owners, they have such a hard challenge on the business side, and then as we're talking about on the OT side. And there's a lot of words out there, convergence of IT and OT. They're two completely separate environments, right? And they need to remain separate, but business will always need to get some data from the OT side to be able to make schedules, maintenance, and all the things that go around with that. But each time they do that, that opens up a potential attack vector. So that's why we talk about resilience. What do we need to do to, one, protect all the assets that we have? And then how do we sustain that, right? How do we manage the tools that we have in place to protect, but also how do we manage the potential consequences that could happen if a bad actor was able to get into an environment, or to the point of, if the business brought down a system, what impact would that have? What consequence would that have on the operational side? So there's just a lot of areas of interest, or a lot of areas of concern that one has to take into managing the grid or managing a fleet of assets. So resilience is critical.
Yeah, and really tying into that, as you're dealing with this, is if I'm going to build a new power plant, like I need to make sure that I have somebody that's thinking about OT and cyber and the networking side and getting data out and OSI Pi and all the things that we know go into it. But so many of these sites were built 40, 50, 60 years ago, and I'm retrofitting them. So I'm bringing things in and I'm duct tape and baling wire and trying to make it work. And we're really good at making those things work, but they're not always the best. Like they're not as an architect, they're not the way that I would design it. Like if I had carte blanche and a blank sheet, that's not how I would do it. A lot of times I have to make it work because that's what I have. And I can't just go rip out a control system and rewire an entire power plant because it's not the way that I want it, right? So I have to make do. And sometimes those things, those are the weaknesses, a chain's only strong as its weakest link. Those are the weaknesses that we find in some of these architectures because there's workarounds that I wasn't aware of, or the plant manager, the DCS owner, or the security folks. They just weren't aware of all these things because these plants have been around for so long. So how do you find those things? How do we design it so that it's resilient, knowing that these are 40-year-old technologies? I've got Windows XP, I've got Sun Solaris, I've got all these things that are against me, but I still have to protect them and make sure, because again, like you said, when that customer flips his light switch on, you and me both, I want my lights to work.
Yeah, especially in the summer, you want your air conditioner to work. You want all those different things to work. But it is a challenge, right? Because you said in the newer sites today, we have that opportunity to build in security by design. Where we're at today at Burns McDonnell, when we do our engineering, procurement, and construction projects, we're trying to build that in the early stages as part of the design phase, right? But we don't have that luxury all the time because, like you mentioned, Aaron, there's sites that have been running for a long time. So then we have to retrofit it in, and it becomes more ad hoc. How do we go about doing that? And working with a lot of the OEM vendors out there, this is where compliance has a benefit because we have tools to go back to the OEMs and say, you know what, we need the systems to be able to do this. We need network segmentation. We need endpoint protection. We need certain things, access management. So we work with those OEMs and like an Emerson and a GE or Hitachi, the main ones out there because we can't do it ourselves, right? Sure. We have to work with them. And then we have to work with the asset owners, the engineers, like the teams that are responsible for this every day. We can't just go in there and say, you know what, you need to do this because you're not secure. You know what, that doesn't work, right? Nope. So you talked about people earlier. So it's like, how can we get the engineers talking with these cybersecurity practitioners? I know there's terminology out there, cyber-informed engineering, right? Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it to reduce our blast radius, really trying to, I always look at how can we simplify our network for design so we can recover, but making sure it's not too simple in the sense that anybody can just walk right in there.
Right.
So it is an ongoing process. Sometimes it starts with an assessment, right? We always talk about, well, how do you secure or protect your systems if you don't even know what exists, right? So It starts with asset management. What is there? When we understand the assets, now we can understand their function. We can talk to the engineers and understand the capabilities or the risks that could happen if this particular HMI workstation or controller was brought down. What does that mean to the overall system itself? And then we can try to start putting in the right level of controls to mitigate that. As a cybersecurity practitioner for 25 years, and I think you would agree, we can't protect everything, right? So we have to find out where are our main pain points, how do we protect them, limit as much remote access as we can into those OT environments. We know you can't be on site all the time. Remote access is needed at times, but how do you do it the right way, right?
Yeah.
It might be a jump host in a DMZ that you have to authenticate using multi-factor authentication. Different layers will further make it more challenging for the bad actors or even insiders, right? From doing things they're not supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And tying that, having an asset inventory is great. And I agree with you. I mean, obviously, we do that, and I've been screaming that from for as long as I've been in this field, right, is how do it's really hard to protect, not that I can't, but it's really hard to protect what I don't know is there. So I can't know what bad looks like if I don't know what good looks like. But taking that a step further, having an asset inventory, if I just have a list of all my PLCs and my SEL relays and my my control systems, my Emersons and my GE Mark 6s and all the different buzzwords, right? If I know what those things are, that's one thing. But the plant manager, the plant, the DCS owner, the control systems engineer, those guys know when they look at, hey, this drop 200 for an Emerson or whatever that thing is, they know it because they work with it every day. They know what those terminologies mean. They know because they work that plant every day. They know what business function those things have. So they know the importance of those devices. Hey, this is just a engineering workstation down in this corner office that we use because we need some overflow. Like if that thing goes down, it's not the end of the world. But this other thing over there, the Bentley Nevada, the vibration monitor, whatever it may be, those other things are more important. So classifying that asset inventory and taking it a step further, assigning risk, assigning a business function, assigning an owner, understanding all, not just what you have, but what function it serves, where, what's its importance in the overall operations of my facility. What is it doing? And then do I have redundancy? Do I have the ability to recover if that thing fails? What is my backup plan? Like, do I have backups and, the disaster recovery plan? So understanding that big picture that goes back to the resilience of the site. And I think so often, we as cyber professionals, not necessarily you and I, but other cyber professionals come down from, hey, I'm from corporate. I'm a cyber guy and I'm here to help you. But they don't understand the business side of things. So they're talking these cyber terms and the plant managers and the DCS owners, et cetera, they don't correlate because we're not tying it to an operational task. Like we really need to start having these conversations and saying, hey, all this cyber stuff, it's really just because we're trying to make your site more reliable. We're trying to make your facility so that I don't patch it at the wrong time, or you don't patch it at the wrong time, or we're not rebooting, or when it goes down, we know which one to focus on first, or when something's happening in this environment, I know where the things to look for. I know what normally talks and what doesn't. So it's really all around having this conversation where everybody's at the table, and we're really informing folks and training people both from the plant to corporate cybersecurity technology side folks and backwards, right? We need to be cross-training everybody. So we're speaking the same language. I think that's been one of the things that's been helpful in my career is understanding the plant operator's perspective as well as the IT cybersecurity perspective and being able to do some translation between those groups to help us have the same conversation instead of talking apples and oranges, right?
And that is the challenge. A lot of times it is apples to oranges, and then you don't get anywhere. And and once again, when you mentioned people early, people is so critical to the process. You can have that shiny piece of technology, you can have all the processes in place, but if the people can't come to an agreement and a general understanding of the why, what we're doing, you're always going to have potential gaps. So knowledge transfer, education, you use the word informing. I mean, those are all critical things. And it's understanding the why. Like I said, we're not doing this to try to be impediment to the production of power. We're doing this to try to protect that site so it can remain operational. Everything will be attacked at some time.
Yep.
Like I said, it doesn't mean a lot of times these control centers and generation sites are multiple layers down inside an environment. It's not externally visible, but that doesn't mean a bad actor can't get in through a phishing attack and then eventually find their way, or an insider, right? We always have to worry about insiders, and maybe it's not malicious. Maybe they're just curious, right? But you still have to have all those controls in place. One, to either to prevent or protect. You also have to detect. You do want to know if somebody is moving around and they shouldn't be there. So, I mean, when you look at it from a simple form, it's like, where are we today? What are we trying to do? Like, what are we trying to protect? These are easy questions to ask, but a lot of times to get the answer or the real answer that you're looking for takes those conversations. It's like you mentioned, it takes a group of people to sit at the table, with different lenses to come to a common understanding. And once again, we talk about compliance. That's where compliance regs do have value. It allows us to have a vehicle to talk about, to say, okay, we want to do more than the standards because we want to make sure that we're not just following the bare minimum. I think Burke came out a couple of weeks ago with incentives for asset owners to do more, to be more proactive in the process. And then they may get incentives on rates and other different things, because I think regulators in the industry know by itself, compliance isn't enough. Compliance, once again, that can't be our ceiling. That's really hard. We have to do this at a bare minimum. If you're doing this, you know what? It's going to protect you to some level, but it doesn't mean you're completely protected. And it's too critical. I know we're spending a lot of time talking about utility and stuff like that, but when you look at critical infrastructure as a whole, the 16 categories, each and every one of them have the similar concerns. The functions that they play are critical to the customers that they have. So they have to do the same thing. So it could be leveraging NIST CSF, or it could be using 62443 in regards to, it could be using ISO, using a general framework out there to be able to give us a baseline on what we're trying to do. We don't want to always reinvent the wheel, but we do have to have something we're striving for. As you know, Aaron, attacks are only getting more complicated. The attackers are getting more sophisticated. They only have to find one gap. We have to try to protect everything. And when we're looking at the infrastructure that we're looking at, we don't have the luxury of patching and doing vulnerability scans and all these things that you may do on that traditional IT side. And even though they're doing it, they're still vulnerable and they're still at risk. So, and you mentioned earlier, we have a lot of legacy systems. So how do we protect that? What do we do? How do we go about doing it? So it's working together as a partner with the asset owners to really try to come to that overall, like I said, that governance and that risk approach where, you know what, we understand we can't do it all. We have to put our dollars here. This is where our biggest risks are. So this is where our attentions have to be. Doesn't mean a year from now that doesn't change, because that attack cycle is continuous and it's always evolving. We may have to reevaluate it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And that's where trying to have a sustainable program or a governing program allows you to do that overall. Like you mentioned, even configuration management, right? We understand a lot of times when the vendors out there, they're looking at it from a functional perspective. Does the system work?
Right.
Not so much, hey, let's get rid of all the default passwords. Let's close down the ports that aren't needed. Logically, as cybersecurity practitioners, that's our approach. But from a functional side, that they don't always look at it that way, or the engineer doesn't. So once again, I think the common theme is it's working together as a team, realistically, to try to do something that may seem simple, but overall complicated because of the type of equipment that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a power plant or any facility, whatever type it is, and find any rules on firewalls or networks that are routed around, like physically a cable bypassing the firewall because they were having an issue at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And at the end of the day, their most important thing is to make sure the plant is available. It's making sure it's running, that it's doing what it's supposed to do, whether it's generating electricity or it's a hospital or whatever that thing is. It has to function. Availability is the most important thing. All that to say, I have a hard time undoing it because it's working. So they don't want to back that out because I don't want to go back to, it wasn't working before, it's working now, just leave it alone. Like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We know that we can't do that. We've got to fix it. But it's part of that because it comes from the lack of trust across the aisle, right? I don't want to get political, but it's like Democrats and Republicans, right? Like they don't want to talk to each other. Right. And it's if we could just sit down and have a conversation and realize, hey, you and I are on the same team and we want the same goal. We both have different things that we're focused on, But at the end of the day, if we can come together and we can build that trust. I have multiple examples through my career where I've had to sit down across the table from a plant manager, a DCS owner, et cetera, that when I showed up, didn't like me, didn't trust me, didn't want my team there, et cetera. And we had to work to build that trust. And then every day I had to work to maintain, once I got the trust, I had to work to maintain that trust. I had to build that hey, threshold and hey, these are the terms that we're going to show up and how we're going to do work and how I'm going to communicate. And I had to make sure that I didn't break his or her trust throughout that process, because as soon as I did, they'd kick me out and they wouldn't let me do my work. Right. And
it's so true.
It was so critical.
I mean, it's even to the point when you go to I don't know, over the years, I've probably been to 150 different generation plants. It's what you wear, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to go to a plant in a suit.
Yep.
If you're going to be walking on the plant floor and inside the control room and out to the PECs and techs and all the different things, right? So of course you have to have your PPE anyway, but it starts with understanding their culture.
Yeah.
Understanding, because that helps start the conversation. You know what? I know what I have to, it's a simple thing. I know what I have to wear. I know what you guys are trying to accomplish. I have to build trust, like you mentioned, and it is a critical thing. And it's something that doesn't happen overnight. Nope. And it can be lost really quickly if you do something silly. So we have a lot of challenges that we're up against in doing it. And that's a lot of times people take for granted. But the only way we're going to get to where we need to get to is to make sure that I say that, but it's also got to be bi-directional on the other end. The engineers or the plant manager and the I&C coach, they also have to understand that we're there for their benefit. We're not there as an auditor or as what it may be. We're there to try to protect. It could be their reputation. It could be, we're there maybe to help them for a compliance reason, right? We're there with intentions to help them, to make sure that they can be operational, that they don't have to worry about bringing their down because they have an event. So the conversation, like you said, I think we used it a couple of times. You have to come to the table. We all have to come to the table, but with open minds.
Yeah. And
that's the only way that you're really going to get to the results that we're trying to get to. Like I used earlier, the wording out there, cyber-informed engineering. It's just I learn more from them than they're probably learning from me. And what helps me later in my next opportunity that I have, right? Or as cybersecurity practitioners, I'm not an engineer by trade, but I've learned a lot over the years that I have pretty good familiarity with it, and I can have that conversation and we can talk about the functional analysis of the system, and now you're building that trust. But that goes a long way, and it's hard to earn, but once you earn it, just don't do anything silly to lose it. Because that's the challenge.
You can think about it and you put it in their terms, right? You know, they're responsible for the location. They're a lot of times their bonuses are tied to it, the livelihood of their employees, the safety and life of people working there. And that's a big thing that's different in OT versus IT. I mean, you walk into a power plant or manufacturing facility, any of this stuff can literally kill you. Like yep. there is literally steam that can cut you in half, and moving equipment and all the time you hear of that stuff. I've seen it personally. I've known people that have lost their lives at facilities, and it's a bad day for us all. And that's why safety culture and that safety availability is so much more important than anything else. Like, you go to a nuclear facility, all they care about is controlling that reactor. Like that's
yep.
it. That is their top priority. Everything else doesn't matter. And if you go to a normal, gas power plant, like their main focus is safety and availability, right? It still all ties to safety. Obviously, the nuclear is just exponentially more so because of the danger of, it going badly. Nobody wants that, but it's that way across all OT environments, whether it's, transportation and maritime or oil and gas or whatever. Like, nobody wants to lose their people. Nobody wants to have an incident where, they're causing loss of limit, people, injuring people, or, obviously their facility going offline and not being able to recover, damaging equipment. I mean, you lose a turbine, it spins out and you damage a turbine, you're down for 2 years. I mean, it's not like you can just go pull one off a shelf somewhere. Like, they're getting built in Germany and shipped over in 2 to 3 years. And with supply chain, it may even be longer than that now. Like, who knows? But it really goes.
Yep. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's it.
No, I mean, I was going to say safety is paramount. I mean, safety first, always. See something, say something. There's such critical things. And I mean, and if we could take that similar mindset and apply it to cyber, I think is a step in the right direction, because it's cyber still. Hey, if I can get remote access and I can do something to that turbine, or I can do something to one of the other areas that are critical, it could have an impact as well. It's just not physically in front of you. And you mentioned supply chain. Supply chain is such a critical component, not just because it's a NERC SIP standard now, but if you look across any industry, understanding your supply chain, not just from the components, from the SBOMs and the HBOMs, but it's also about the availability. Like you mentioned, that turbine goes down, it's X amount of years before you're going to get a new one. But if I have a vendor that has X amount of switches or something else, and I don't have a stockpile and it's 18 months until I'm going to be able to get new gear, you have to know that ahead of time. So it also goes back to the whole planning, right? When we talk about resilience, like we talk about identity, protect, respond, recover, but it's also about planning. It's about understanding that if this happens, this is what we do. Like you mentioned earlier, when we talked about sites 40 years ago, a lot of those sites were manual, right? Everything was done manual. As we advanced with technology, we've now made things IP related, automatic. So that introduced a whole different cycle out there. So it just changed a little bit. But those legacy systems, as they're critical to those operations, and not all the time can you replace that with a newer system, right? Because there may be a platform out there that's legacy. It's a Windows embedded system that it's providing a function. That vendor may not even be in existence anymore, but you can't get rid of it, right? So there's just a lot of nuances that we have to talk about. And when we talk, like I said, and it goes back to, so who are your vendors? What are they? How dependent are you on them? We know with generation sites, you have the OEMs, the Emersons, the GEs. They have their service level agreements on what they're doing to make sure the systems work functionally. But at the same time, a lot of times over the years, we've done factory acceptance testing, right? To really make sure ahead of time, because you can't do that. The plants are usually in outage for a short period of time, right?
Right.
So we got to do our testing, usually at the factory floor of the vendor, trying to embed security into the functions and make sure it all works. So when it gets shipped, we can then just put it in, do our final testing. This covers all the requirements for NERC SIP in regards to change management and configuration management, make sure all that documentation is provided, but also really challenging those vendors on the security of their systems. And they've come a long way over the years, from where it was 10 years ago to what they're doing today. A lot of them actually have a security stack built in. And then it's not as many changes required, but it's really about bringing it all together. And once again, I can't stress the importance of that communication, because we'll go back to resilience. We talked about impact. I mean, how can I determine the impact of a particular BES cyber asset or a BES cyber system without the input of that engineer who's responsible for that?
You can't.
And if you don't, then you're building controls that could now have a potential adverse effect. So you do need to. So when we categorize the assets and we identify the risk to the assets, once we get to determine the impact, that's when we have to really work together to understand, well, this is that impact, because now you can build controls tailored around that impact without us being a road bump, speed bump, whatever word you want to use, to the functional side of it. The landscape changes every day. That threat landscape is changing constantly. So we always have to, I think planning is critical to any program in place. If it's new, just building that early on. We talked about security by design. But even if we're doing an upgrade or we're just bolting on a new, like you mentioned earlier, Bentley, Nevada, really walk through that process of that upgrade and that addition to the system to understand all the impacts, because technology is a great thing, but it can also be a disruption. As business will always want the data from it, how can we do that without opening up more risk?
Yeah. Yeah. And, ultimately that's what's caused some of this convergence of technology that has, commercially off the shelf equipment has gotten thrown into OT. And that's really what's driven this is we want data out. We want to be able to be more efficient. And it's done a great job at that, but it's also brought these risks in with it. So talk a little bit about, we've talked about a lot about power and some of these critical infrastructures, but a lot of these larger companies are either, maybe they've got generation, they've got manufacturing, they've got oil and gas, they've got, gas pipeline, they've got rail. They have a lot of different regulations that they have to comply with. Maybe they're international as well, and they've got, other compliance regulatory, requirements in the EU or, in Australia or wherever. From a compliance perspective as a company, and you look at GRC and from a global type company, it's really hard to understand and really what do I comply with? Like what this asset, do I need to comply with this and that and all that? So talk a little bit about all those different compliance things and just an overall policy of how to really keep up to date with things, as well as maintaining the real focus, which is making sure that the business risk is considered in all of these things, right?
No, that's a great question. And it is a challenge, and it's a challenge for, a lot of times when you're looking at the multinational organizations, the large IOUs, or even if it's outside utilities, they have a whole number of regulations. And the challenge that I've seen over the years, when I was a CISO, we were in 17 countries, and it was food manufacturing. Not that there's a lot of regulation around the cyber side there, but there was a lot of regulation around food, around privacy, around a number of other things because of the workforce in food manufacturing. That same concept really applies across every industry out there. That what I saw is everybody dealt with it almost in a siloed base. So in the EU, they were doing their thing, and then in the States, they were doing their thing. At the individual state level, they were doing their own thing, and there was no overall governance thing to say, hey, how do we make this, because that's not sustainable, right?
Right.
It's not sustainable to do it in a vacuum. You have to do it programmatically at the governance level. There's got to be data governance. There's got to be a structure that's driving these efforts. Otherwise, you're duplicating efforts. Already don't have the right people or enough people. So how can you streamline that stuff? How can you try to benefit and do the crosswalks, the mappings across the standards, if it's the ISO or if it's a NIST standard, as you mentioned, if it's one of the standards coming out of EU or Australia, who are becoming more driven around that, because that regulations provide value. It has to be done as a community. Realistically, it might be a structured team across the organization working together. But we want to see results. I know what we do, we are actually doing it as a service for a lot of our clients today to try to help them build out what that may look like, or even manage it for them. Because as you mentioned, it takes a lot of manpower, especially if you're dealing with a number of different regs, right? I've seen NERC SIP teams of 25, 30 different people, right? If they didn't have that burden, or if they had structure and governance around that, maybe it takes 12, and then the other group can do other things around the cyber and around the risk management side of things. So it's a pain point. I don't know if I have the direct answer, but it has to be done as a team effort. There's got to be a governing body usually driving it at the organizational level. Otherwise, you have to have a stakeholder who's going to champion those efforts. Otherwise, they're going to fail. So a lot of times what we go in there, we help programmatically build what that structure may look like for that particular entity. Because even though regulations are on paper and everybody's got to apply, everybody's approach may be slightly different. So ultimately, it's about right sizing the solution for that particular client. When we're talking about OT, a lot of times we're not talking about privacy related stuff, but at the business level, that organization still has to deal
Yep.
with all the privacy side. So why not bring it together just to see where you can benefit from those scales where team members, you may have an expert over here that the group on the other side doesn't even know exists, right? So it's one of those things will always be a challenge, but it can be managed if it's done at that governing level. And I think it's important to have a champion within the organization that's really leading that effort.
Well, and that experience makes a big difference. Like having seen these implementations of large scale programs and compliance and going through audits and understanding what the language is meaning in this region versus that region and this particular, subcomponent of this particular thing, right? Is I can make my assumptions, but it makes a big difference when I have an experienced group and organization that has seen it and can have their, you're paying for that knowledge. And instead of reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch and trying to build it, grassroots, really, getting exponentially further down the road by that knowledge and experience. And the thing with compliance that I always tell people, and as I'm explaining compliance to somebody that's never dealt, specifically like with NERC CIP, is you can be 99.999% and you're not compliant. Like you are either 100% compliant or you're not compliant. Like there is no gray area. You are all compliant or you are not compliant. If you miss one thing, one day of note or documentation or logs, or I did 9 out of my 10 servers or 1,000 out of 1,001 servers, I'm not compliant. And that's a big, now granted, are the auditors going to throw the book at you because you missed one? If you can show that you were doing your best, blah, 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 that's not the point. The point is technically you were out of compliance. And they can throw the book at you and they can fine you and they can do all the things that the regulation says to do, which is why it's so important that we're not just looking at these compliance regulations as I've got to do this. Talking with a couple of other, we had a webinar not too long ago and an expert in the field. And we were talking about that and one of the things he really talked about was, hey, with this new regulation that's coming out, don't look at it as I've got to do this. Look at it as, hey, this is an opportunity to get some funding. And instead of just checking the box to do the bare minimum, what can I do with this? What value can I get that'll help my operations, that'll help my business, that'll help me be, have a better understanding of my environment, lower my business risk, all those types of things. If you change your focus and look at that from that perspective, then it's not a chore. It's enjoying it. You're being able to provide value to the organization, not just a box I've got to check because, some regulator said I've got to, have this compliant activity that I don't even think is valuable.
No, and I mean, look at the one that's coming down the pipe, the information security network monitoring, right?
Yep.
It's a new regulation. It's going to change the landscape because in the past, we've always looked north to south. Hey, what's coming in and out of the firewall, right? Very important. And I'm glad they're looking egress, right, as well, because a lot of times, hey, we're focusing on what's coming in, but realistically, we need to know what's going out.
Yep.
But now with the new regulation that's going to come out, it's now looking east to west. What's moving around inside the environment, which is going to change the landscape. No, it's increasing the risk area. I mean, it's increasing the value of what cybersecurity and monitoring and protection can do. It's also helping identify earlier on, right, and being a little bit more proactive in the process rather than reacting. But it's also right now, I think they're talking about for high and medium, but at some point it may go down to the low site. So for those sites, which I think was a great opportunity a few years ago when site like generation plants would segment their infrastructure because they wanted no one common asset to be able to impact 1,500 megawatts, which goes back to what I was talking about, that blast radius. We're trying to keep it.
Yep.
So by doing that segmentation, you're reducing your compliance burden. You're also reducing some of your risk because you're separating your networks. Now with this new thing, it's going to allow having that visibility, like I said, east to west instead of just straight in and out. And when it comes to low, so those sites that separated and they don't have that common, they're still going to have obligations with that standard, with future standards, but they're setting themselves up. And that goes back to where you could be proactive. where you can have somebody working with you to manage and monitor what's coming down the pipe as it relates to regulation and how do we protect ourselves? How do we stay ahead of the curve, right? That's the whole idea. I don't know what the current statistic is, but I think in 2022, it was something like it was 70 days before somebody realized and this is more IT than OT, that a bad actor was in your environment, and
Right.
it was like 160 days before the whole life cycle, and that's improved tremendously from 3 years ago. But just think, a bad actor in your environment for 70 days that you didn't know, what could they do, right? So having that new requirement would hopefully help identify that earlier on. So ultimately, once again, I look at compliance as that vehicle to help move us in the right direction. We talked about it earlier. You can be secure and not compliant. You can be compliant, not secure. It really depends on the lens that you're looking at it in. But once again, I think as practitioners and as the industry is evolving, it's really all about risk and managing those risks and managing those thresholds. What risk to your organization may vary, risk to a different organization. Compliant will be the same, but risk itself, the tolerance for risks, will vary. So
yeah. I mean, I just saw something come out the other day. I drive a Toyota truck, and I saw Toyota has announced that they'd had basically somebody was inside their system and could show where all the Toyota vehicles that had GPS located in them for the past 10 years.
Yeah, I saw that.
So they'd owned this system for 10 years and they had no idea that they were in there, right? So that just shows you that persistence in that environment. Now, granted, it's not I guess, it could be argued if it's an OT, it's in an IT system, but it can impact OT, vehicle type systems. Could they do other things? I don't know, but that just goes to show. And I know good and well, Toyota spends a lot of money and does the right things in cybersecurity. I know they do. I have a lot of folks that I know that have worked on cybersecurity programs at Toyota on both the IT and the OT side. So it's not that they're not wanting to do the right things. It just shows how hard this is. Like to your point, we have to protect everything. An attacker just has to find one way in that we haven't caught and get in the door before we close it behind them and hope that we don't see them in there. Right.
And understanding, because you mentioned earlier, you have the right technology, but is that technology configured? Are we just getting so much information that we don't know how to even identify the anomalies because we're just got data overload, which is probably more of an issue on the IT side than it is on the OT side. But you'll have those firewalls that segment the OT from the networks and stuff like that. It's important to understand how to configure them, how to eliminate the noise, how to really focus in on the actionable events. And I think this is where workflow and some automation, machine learning helps, but still somebody has to understand the logic that needs to apply to that system. It could be a pipeline, which is going to be different than a generation plant, which is going to be different than a charging station for an electric vehicle, right? There's a lot of nuances that as practitioners, you're expected to understand in order to configure and make sure that you're giving yourself a fighting chance.
Yeah. And that's it. It all comes down. I know we've said it 100 times today, probably, but it all comes down to availability. Like, we want these things to work, and we don't want to be a burden on these operations environments. But it's not enough. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they did it all themselves. The plant managed the system, the vendors, it was a proprietary system, and it was this black box of technology that nobody understood. And you kept your hands off of it. They brought it in, they set it up, and only the vendor touched it. Yep. It's not that way anymore. And the operations groups and the cyber groups and the corporate groups, we've got to work together. And it really comes down to that, whether it's finding consulting, companies like Burns and Mac that have the experience and know what to look for and can help you quick start those programs and even run it for you if you don't have the team for yourself. But ultimately, it's all about having the right people at the table and looking at it openly. You don't need a yes man that says, oh yeah, we're all good. You don't need the sergeant that's like, nope, we're all good here, nothing to see. You want to show, the ugliness, the misconfiguration, the disconnect, or hey, yeah, I don't have enough people to get all those things patched, so I haven't patched those systems, or I haven't, mitigated however I was going to mitigate those problems, because ultimately, the Target attack, going all the way back to Target, right? It wasn't Target that got hit. It was a small vendor that was attached to Target. Like, that's usually where it is. It's that, again, like I said before, it's your chain's only strong as your weakest link. Like, that weakest link, if you aren't looking for it, you're going to get hit, and you're not going to know it until it's too late. You're 10 years down the road in your Toyota, and you have to publicly announce that they've been in your system for 10 years, which is just insane.
And then even like you take Colonial Pipeline, right? It was an IT thing. I believe it was something to do with a password for a system. I forgot exactly what it was. And it goes back down to the consequence, right? By bringing down some of the IT systems, they thought they were doing the right thing. They probably were, to make sure that ransomware didn't run parent, but it had a major impact on their OT environment when they brought it down. So it just, understanding the consequence is really critical. And I think that's one of the values, like you mentioned, of working for Burns McDonnell, being an engineering firm across every critical infrastructure. We got the luxury of 13,000 engineers really to pick their brain and understand. So when we're bringing our expertise from cyber to our clients, we're bringing it with an engineering mindset, which what we talked about, trust, right? Where now they trust us. So and at the end of the day, we're building power plants and substations and control centers, right? So as building that, now we're actually able to take our cybersecurity expertise and bring it into the builds. What we were talking about, how do you get that into today's world? We'll always have the challenge of retrofitting sites that have been around for a long time. That's a necessary thing that we'll always have to deal with. But we don't want to recreate that same lessons learned of bolting on something later when we don't need to, especially as we're moving to renewables, more battery, more solar, wind, onshore, offshore. Each one of them, I mean, with battery storage becoming what it is, renewables are going to become more critical to the overall power grid and stuff like that. So making sure, even if it's a one solar site or wind site, it's only doing X amount of megawattage, as a whole, it's going to have a bigger increase. So we have to put security in there as well, and not just look at these larger sites. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that's the key, right? Is we have to be planning for this. This isn't going away. It's not I installed this firewall and I'm done. It's not a whatever, right? It's here to stay, and we're going to have to be. It's a constant evolving. The tactics are changing. It's warfare, right? We are at war with whoever the bad actors that are trying to get this, and we are going to have to constantly be adapting to whatever use cases they're bringing, whatever attack vectors they come with, whatever new sneak attacks they have, whatever those things are. We've got to be nimble. So along with that, it kind of leads into my final question of next 5 to 10 years. What is something that you're like hopeful for, excited for, looking forward towards in cyber, and maybe something that's concerning or really upsetting as far as that you see on the horizon?
Well, it almost could be the same answer. Like, we look at AI, we talk about AI out there, really. I mean, there's so many strengths and benefits that AI can bring to us as practitioners that we can leverage to not only make our jobs more efficient, we're able to get things done in seconds versus hours and days. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of benefit there, but at the same time, there's a lot of scary there as well, because the good things you can do with technology, there's bad actors that will do bad things with that similar technology. Now, my belief with AI is it'll still always require some form of human involvement. If that ever escapes, where it's pure AI, I mean, cyborgs and all those things and stuff like that, that's going to be a scary time. But we do have to adopt. Technology is continuously changing. We talked about a little earlier that years ago, everything was manual. When technology came in, it's now more automatic. Business wants information, wants data. So that's never going to change, right? So we always have to make sure we're staying continuous. We're continually improving the way we do things. Like you mentioned, the firewall. 10 years ago, yeah, I had a firewall. That's no longer the case because the cloud, SaaS, the edges changed. So I think I'm looking forward to how we can change with the direction that technology brings us. But and that can help compliance, that can help governance, that can help risk, right? We got to benefit or use those tools to benefit us, and then just try to mitigate the areas where it may involve risk.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree, man. AI is a great thing, but it can be a strength or a weakness. It just depends on how it's used and who's using it. And if we don't use it well enough and the bad guys are using it against us, then that makes them all that much more powerful. So that can be scary for sure. So hey, tell us about you and how does somebody get a hold of you guys and if they were interested in some of y'all's services?
So like I mentioned, I'm with Burns McDonnell, a part of T&D Transmission and Distribution. You can reach out to me via email, my LinkedIn profile, or the website. There's a number of other team members there as well. But yeah, I look forward to this conversation, future conversations with you, Aaron. And then if there's anybody out there that's looking for knowledgeable expert people in OT and cybersecurity, risk governance, and compliance, we're your guys.
Awesome, Michael. I appreciate the time, sir. As always, I enjoy the conversation.
Same here, good sir.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.